All right, welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. My name is Dylan Brewer, and I'm a student hourly worker here at the Biotech Center. On behalf of the Biotechnology Center, UW-Madison Division of Extension, Wisconsin Public Television, Wisconsin Alumni Association, and UW Science Alliance, welcome to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight is my pleasure to introduce you to Maya Pershi. Tonight, she will be talking about the cascading effects of open oak woodland restoration. Before we get started, we're going to get to know our speaker a little bit better by asking her the infamous 5 questions. All right, Maya, where were you born?
I was actually born in Madison, Wisconsin, so I'm a local.
And where did you go to high school?
I lived most of my life up until high school in Baraboo, so just a little bit north of here, and a place I'll be talking about a lot tonight. So Baraboo High.
And where did you go for your undergrad degree?
UW-Madison.
Awesome. And where did you go for any advanced degrees?
UW-Madison.
Awesome. And what did you study in undergrad, and where did you go on to get your advanced degrees in?
So I've been a wildlife ecology major and master's student, and now PhD student. So
awesome. Well, thank you very much for speaking tonight. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Maya Pershi.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here tonight, and it's great to see so many of you here on a beautiful night to learn more about woodland restoration and learn a little bit about my research. How is my volume? Can everyone hear me okay? Great. A little bit louder? Yeah. Did that help at all? Great. Okay. So I'll be talking about woodland restoration generally tonight, kind of giving an overview of what some problems are, some woodland degradation problems here in southern Wisconsin and around the Midwest. And then also talking about my PhD research that I've been working on for the past couple of years in the Baraboo Hills, which is just north of here. I think woodland restoration is one of the more uplifting topics that we can think about in the fields of conservation and ecology right now. And I'm obviously a little bit biased, but I think it's a really interesting topic, kind of at the intersection of biodiversity conservation, historical ecology, and landscape resilience. So as I'm going through this tonight, if there's anything that you want me to explain a little bit more, feel free to stop me, and then we'll have time at the end too for questions. I understand. Great. So first, probably if any of you have spent time exploring southern Wisconsin or this part of the world, you've encountered open oak woodland ecosystems at some point, whether or not you noticed. And I really like this picture here in the upper corner. It really, I think, does a good job describing the kind of the structure of woodland ecosystems. So you can see that the oak trees have like an open branching structure, which allows a lot of light to reach the forest floor. And this is really important because most of the biodiversity that we talk about being in these woodland ecosystems is in the ground layer. So you can think about herbaceous plants and insects. It's a really rich ecosystem, but becoming increasingly rare. And if you look to the past, these are both different versions of pre-settlement maps. One of Eastern North America that shows all of like the pale gray colored areas are open oak or pine ecosystems. And so you can see it was a really expansive area prior to settlement. In Wisconsin, we're actually lucky to have really detailed maps of the pre-settlement vegetation. And this is due largely to the work of David Mladenoff, who is a professor in the Forest and Wildlife Ecology Department here. And he and his team spent a lot of time looking at public land survey data, which is a really tedious process of looking back to land survey records and finding the notes about survey trees, marker trees that were used. And based on the species and how large the trees were, where they were located, they reconstructed a vegetation history that we're so lucky to have today when we think about conservation. So if you look at the little map of Wisconsin, kind of in the middle, mid-1800s, you'll see that the northern area, so north of the vegetation tension zone, was dominated by closed canopy woodlands. And then in the south, we see a mixture of prairie and savanna and some woodland patches. This has changed after agriculture, settlement, fire suppression. And so what we see today is that in southern Wisconsin, the landscape is mostly dominated by agriculture with small patches of closed canopy forest. So this is a really big change. And in addition to losing some of the extent of these woodland ecosystems, the composition of the tree species within them has changed a lot as well. And this is kind of a confusing map, but you can see that little green area that's kind of at the corner of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa. That's the driftless area. And so that's what's highlighted in the larger image here. And in the mid-1800s, white oaks were the dominant tree species, so indicated by the darker color there. And that was pretty much across the entire driftless. Other species were present as well, but these were in lower numbers. And so after over a century of fire suppression, what you see in the bottom line, the 2000s, which has continued on to today, is that other species are more dominant and oaks have lost a lot of dominance. And other species, in this case, actually is referring to elms and ashes. And these species are native. They've always been present in Wisconsin, but in lower numbers. And so when we're seeing them rise to being the dominant tree species, this represents a novel woodland condition. And so these new conditions, it's not something necessarily bad in and of itself, but it does bring up questions about how much biodiversity do these new woodlands support. And so what has caused this really dramatic change in forest composition over the past 150 years? This lines up really well with the timeline of fire suppression throughout Eastern North America. And I really like this image. It's a little bit tough to see, but it's actually from a report of the forest by C.S. Sargent. And this is an image that was reported by different landowners and farmers during the 1884 census. And each person reported what percent of their woodland had been burned that year. And at that time, a woodland being burned was considered to be like a problem. It was a loss of money, basically, because timber was seen as a resource. And so the darker colors on this map refer to woodlots that were burned at over 10%. And so if you extrapolate across the whole eastern United States, we're seeing a pretty high amount of fire right around the time of settlement. And actually, this settlement period fire was not necessarily out of the normal. There's been a lot of work recently trying to reconstruct fire histories in different habitats around the eastern United States. And in particular, in Wisconsin, Jed Munier has looked at fire scars on trees and reconstructed a fire history going back 400 years that shows that on average, the fire return interval in Wisconsin was every 8 years. So pretty frequently, each place in the state was being burned.
When you say burn, you mean controlled burning?
No, at this point, it was probably either wildfires or fires that had been like ignited by indigenous people. So yeah, not the controlled burns that we see today. And so just to contrast that map and this 8-year mean fire return interval, I know you can't really see the names of these fires or the acreage very well, but all of the red areas on this map are the entire area of wildfire that's burned in Wisconsin from settlement until today. So this is a very different picture from fire happening every 8 years. And this kind of indicates that a pretty important process, an ecological process, has been lost. And for those of you who are already woodland restorationists and land managers, this is not going to be very new for you. But I just want to talk a little bit about what happens to a forest when fire isn't present anymore. And there's a process called musification that you might have heard. This refers to like a mesic forest condition. So you could think about like a cool, shady forest, which is very different from an open oak ecosystem. This first picture, the pre-1900s picture, would be like a fire-adapted system. And after fire is gone for a while, usually due to fire suppression, in this case, more shrubs and trees start to grow. It's a positive feedback loop. And as more plants grow, the understory microclimate changes. And eventually, fire-adapted species are no longer able to germinate. And the composition kind of shifts away to the point where you don't have a lot of the understory biodiversity anymore. And in this case, this is usually when our forests are shifting into novel tree species composition as well. And so this is what fire suppression can look like. This might be pretty familiar to you if you spent time in forested areas around Madison. The first picture shows a remnant oak opening. And so you can see light is reaching the forest floor. It's a carpet of wildflowers in the spring. This is a shooting star in the foreground here. And just about 1 kilometer away in this other forest, ironwood and maple, which are shade tolerant species, have grown in. And so if you look down at the forest floor, it's just leaf litter at this point. We've lost a lot of species there. There's been a lot of work studying the effects of fire suppression on prairie plants because prairies are even more fire dependent than oak woodland ecosystems. And this is the work of Amy Alstead, who was in the botany department here a few years ago. And she was resurveying remnant patches of prairie that had been surveyed by John Curtis, who was a botanist here, who did the work in the 1950s. And then these same patches were surveyed again in the 1980s, and then again in the 2010s. And it's kind of a confusing plot, but if you think about each axis as just describing some aspect of a plant community, so probably changed based on which plants are there, you can think of it almost like a Venn diagram. So between 1950 and 1980, there's some overlap. And so there's some similarity about those plant communities, or you could recognize that they're in the same place and they were at one point the same. But by the time the 2010 surveys happened, this community had drifted so far apart that you actually can't even really tell that it's changed in a lot of ways. And we can see that it's so much further away from the 1980s that the pace of the change has been accelerating over time. And this is kind of the effects of fire suppression over a very long time. And I think to me, what's interesting about this is that we know that plant compositions change in the absence of fire, but I think it's easy to think of it as a process that already happened and forget that it's still happening really quickly on our landscapes. So these are, again, 2 pictures of areas that haven't had fire for about 150 years, from what I can tell, in my study areas. And you can see that fire suppression looks really different in places with different site characteristics. And so both of these, though, either way, results in a really low diversity of herbaceous plants on the understory, either through a dense mid-story layer in this first picture or a dense understory shrub layer in the second picture. And both of these sites have oak-dominated canopies, which means that these changes have taken place in the last 100 years. And so luckily, there's been a lot of work to learn how to restore woodlands that have become degraded through fire suppression. And controlled burning is one really important way to do this, as well as thinning the understory and midstory to kind of steer the composition of communities back towards historical conditions. There's a lot of great examples of ecosystems that have been restored this way. I really like this example. It's from Tennessee, but picture A before restoration looks so much like sites where I work that have become degraded. And between picture A and picture B, there were 3 controlled burns, a pretty significant round of tree thinning, but only 8 years. And so these changes can happen pretty quickly. This is from the same site in Tennessee, and this is kind of a lot to take in. So let's see. I guess not everyone will be able to see the same thing at the same time, so I'll just describe it for those of you on Zoom. So each place has several study sites. So Catoosa Wildlife Management, Green River. And then in each of those places, the vertical gray lines refer to some management treatment. So either a controlled burn or a thinning event. And you can see the corresponding years at the bottom. And then each group of study sites within one of these natural areas it shows some response of, at the top, the graminoid ground covers, the amount of different grasses. The middle layer is forb ground cover. So what % of the ground is taken up by forbs? And then herbaceous plant diversity is on the bottom. I think what's interesting to note about these is that the solid black line with the squares is the control site in each case that wasn't managed at all. And so you can see these really diverging paths that each of these sites take. And this study and many others, I think, are really strong evidence that we can restore the plant communities in open oak woodlands based on management. But my research takes a slightly different approach. So I'm asking how woodland management affects kind of our generalist forest bird species. So birds that you think of as requiring these really large areas of habitat. And these are kind of our like iconic Wisconsin summer bird species. Probably a lot of these are familiar to you. You can see them either right here in Madison, or some like the cerulean warbler are common in my study area. And it is pretty disheartening to see figures like this. 170 million eastern forest birds have been lost since 1970. So that's a really significant decline. And there's evidence that these declines are actually related to habitat on the breeding ground. So the habitat that's right here in our backyards. And so while that's concerning, it also means that we have the ability to respond in some ways. And so that's what I'm interested in looking at. People have studied the effects of like structural habitat conditions on birds. So what happens if you remove like the mid-story or thin the understory of a forest? But I'm curious about a connection between caterpillar availability, so a main food source for forest birds, and how that affects bird populations and bird species richness. So that's what I'll be focusing on. We already know that caterpillar biomass and caterpillar species aren't distributed evenly across forested ecosystems. And a lot of this uneven distribution may be related to the fact that caterpillars, some are generalists, but many are also species specific. So they only will be found on a few host species. And different tree and shrub species support vastly different numbers of Lepidoptera larvae, which also means caterpillar. So if you look at the top line, the Quercus genus, which is the oaks, supports 534 species of Lepidoptera. And then if you contrast that with one of the species closer to the bottom, basswood, 149. So that's a really big difference. And so you can see how changing the species composition of a forest might have these really big effects that kind of ripple through different trophic levels. And this is a book written by Douglas Tallamy, who's one of the authors on this paper. That's a great resource if you're interested in trying to improve bird habitat. So I'll be describing my field study today. That's what I've been working on for the past couple of years as part of my PhD. And I work up in the Baraboo Hills. So if you've been to Devil's Lake, this is kind of that landscape. I'm really lucky to be able to work here to be answering this question, because decades of really strong conservation work in this area mean that we have large places where we have a lot of contiguous forests. And so we're able to ask a question about woodland restoration and isolate it from other threats that might be affecting southern Wisconsin forests. So things like housing development, invasive species, roaming cats and dogs. We're kind of able to just focus on this one question. We're also really lucky to be able to be working with the Nature Conservancy, as well as private landowners who are actually here tonight. So that kind of gives you an idea of the conservation spirit of this landscape. And to really try to follow up on management work that's happened to ask, how does it affect the biodiversity? Beyond just creating conditions to regenerate oak trees, are we able to support bird populations? What happens to insect populations, et cetera? And we've collected quite a lot of data on this, but today I'll just kind of be focusing on this one question. So here's my study area. Devil's Lake would be like just cut off of the picture here. I have 5 managed oak woodland sites and 5 unmanaged sites, and these are each paired based on site conditions. Our study areas, so our sites have all been managed for anywhere from 2 to about 10 years. And so already we're seeing big changes in the herbaceous plant community that are pretty much in line with the other studies that I mentioned today. So if you look at the box plots on the side, each one of those codes refers to a site, and the brown colors are all managed sites and the greenish blue is unmanaged. So you can see pretty strong differences in these sites. And I think this picture, which is taken right at the edge of one of the management units, illustrates that really well too. Probably about 7 years ago, you wouldn't have seen any difference in the forest between the really dense unmanaged part and the managed site. And so my research questions are how does this woodland management influence arthropod biomass? And in particular, does it cause changes in caterpillar biomass? And is this reflected in the bird community? And I mean this in several ways. Is the bird species richness higher in sites that have been managed, or the abundance of some key foraging guilds? And do either of these things result in changes to something called a mass abundance ratio or mass abundance scaling, which I'll explain in a little bit. And just to get everyone thinking along the same lines that I was thinking when I started this fieldwork, these are my predictions. I thought that caterpillar biomass would be positively related to oak woodland structure and species compositions. And I thought that this would result in a higher insectivorous bird species richness and abundance of most foraging guilds except the ground foragers. And again, I'll talk about that later. I also thought that these changes would result in the mass abundance ratio of the understory insectivorous bird community being parallel between managed and unmanaged sites. And so what this means is that I thought management wouldn't influence any fundamental properties or resource partitioning among the bird community. So you can think of this, let's just look at like the unmanaged graph here and forget the title for a second. This is a really fundamental property of ecosystems where you would expect there to be fewer large-bodied animals than small-bodied animals in any ecosystem. And this just makes sense energetically, right? Like we would expect there to be fewer deer, ideally, than mice in a Wisconsin woodland. And so this should hold true across any system. In my case, fewer larger birds than smaller birds. And I expected this to be the same ratio in managed sites, just more birds of all body sizes, which is a response to a higher caterpillar abundance or more food or energy in the system. So hold that thought. We'll circle back to this. So I collected data with a really amazing crew of field techs and volunteers and friends over the past couple years. And I'll be doing this again in 2023. And again, I'm just kind of highlighting one strand of this research tonight, which is our foliage arthropod surveys, caterpillar counting, basically, some bird point counts, and also some bird banding work that we have been doing. So we were really lucky to connect with a program called Caterpillars Count, which is a community science project run by Dr. Alan Hurlbert from University of North Carolina. And the goal of this project is to quantify caterpillar biomass and like peak seasonal timing across the eastern forest, and it's actually expanded now to a global project, but to try to capture these really detailed field observations from certain places on a larger scale. So thinking kind of along the lines of something like iNaturalist, but specifically for caterpillar biomass, which translates to bird food resources. And so you can see the southern Wisconsin sites are all ours. We have a whole network up there. It's a really fun program to check out, though. I'd recommend if you're curious about bird habitat, even in your backyard. We also have been running bird banding sites as part of the Institute for Bird Populations MAPS program. And MAPS stands for Measuring Avian Productivity and Survivorship. And so we are banding birds using passive mist nets, which means we're not luring birds in at all, but birds that happen to fly into our mist nets will be banded. We take a series of measurements related to their health and body condition and structural size, and then we release them on site. And so this ability to capture and recapture animals is really important for learning about populations. And what's really nice about MAPS is that if I go to a place and do an auditory bird survey, so just listening to what birds are around, I'll have a sense of the population size, but I won't know if those individuals are in really good health, if they're the same individuals that were there the previous year, if they've nested successfully. And so we're able to kind of isolate really particular things that are happening within bird populations. And this takes a couple years. So we're still in the early phases of this, but for our common birds, we're hoping by the end of either next year or the year after to get a good population vital rate estimate. So I'll get to a few preliminary results now. These are from 2022. And so we did actually find higher caterpillar biomass in our 5 managed sites compared to the 5 unmanaged sites. And these plots are a little bit busy, so I'll walk you through them. This first one with the 2 kind of squiggly lines, on the bottom axis, I have Julian date, which is just a numerical way of thinking about dates. And so it runs from about mid-May to early August in this graph. And then the y-axis is biomass of caterpillars in milligrams per 50 leaves. So this is derived from using allometric equations, kind of scaling like how many grams of food are actually available to birds per 50 leaf area. And so it seems like really small differences, but if you think about how many sections of 50 leaves there are in a mature oak woodland, this can scale up really quickly. So we notice right away that peak caterpillar biomass in this site falls during the month of June. And that's really typical for northern temperate forests. It aligns with peak bird nesting season. And I use always the brown color for our managed sites. So we see that it's a lot higher in those sites than the unmanaged paired sites. And this is true during just June and across the season as well. And caterpillar biomass is associated with a low basal area of trees, so low tree stalking, a high percent of oak trees in the canopy, and variation in understory humidity, which comes from patches of sunlight being able to reach the ground and kind of cause this variation in abiotic conditions. And so this was really exciting to me because these are some of the key things that people manage for when they're trying to create woodland habitat. And caterpillars here were highest in abundance on oak trees, which was good to see. That was in line with the study that I pointed out earlier. What's interesting, though, is that the tree species that has the second highest caterpillar species richness, which is the plums and the cherries, for us was actually the species that had the lowest biomass of caterpillars. And so we can see that extrapolating from like a lit review study, so a study that looks at a lot of different places, a lot of different ecosystems, doesn't translate exactly to here. And so this is something I'm still working on now, is trying to understand what are our tree species that host the most caterpillar biomass. And so how did this affect the bird community? If you look at these 2 dots here, and the line that connects them represents each study site group. And we see higher bird richness in the managed site across the board at all of our sites. And what I think is interesting here is that there's very few bird species in southern Wisconsin that are woodland obligates. So species that would only be found in woodlands and not other types of forests. And so if we were thinking just about those species, we would imagine that at most, there would be a difference of 5 birds between a managed and unmanaged pair. But we see that in some cases, the difference is much higher. It's like 7 to 10 in some cases. And so this indicates that in unmanaged sites, even some of the more common forest birds that could be there are not, which kind of points back to the really strong bird declines that we're seeing throughout this area. We did see that bird species richness was strongly correlated to the proportion of oaks in the canopy, and also correlated with caterpillar biomass in the understory. So kind of as we had predicted. And to get a little more detailed look at what's going on with different bird species, I calculated the abundance of the most common bird species that we encountered at every site. And I have these kind of organized by foraging guild so that we can think a little bit about which insect species might be causing population changes. For the first guild, the aerial insectivorous, this is an eastern wood pewee. So this is a species that catches insects in the air. And we see that it's more common in managed sites than unmanaged. For the birds that forage, as bark gleaners and wood drillers, the nuthatches, woodpeckers. The 2 most common species were both more abundant in managed sites. And for the ground foragers, there were mixed results. And this is kind of as I had expected. So in managed sites, the ground fires burn the leaf litter, And this is important foraging habitat and nesting habitat also for some birds, especially ovenbird. And so you can see that eastern towhee and American robin are both more abundant in managed sites, but wood thrush is about equal between the sites, and ovenbird seems to be having a negative response to management. For the foliage gleaning birds that are mostly in the understory, the house wren, the American redstart, and the indigo bunting, all three of these species were more common in managed sites. And same with the three species that forage in the mid-story and canopy, scarlet tanager, cerulean warbler, blue-gray gnatcatcher, all more abundant after management. And for the three foliage gleaning species that have more variable foraging heights, two of them, the red-eyed vireo and the black-capped chickadee, were more abundant in unmanaged areas. And so this is kind of an interesting counterintuitive finding. But I think it is worth pointing out that these are two of the most abundant species we encountered at any of our sites this summer. And so if you look at the y-axis, you'll see that their populations are pretty high in both managed and unmanaged sites. But it's still something we're interested in monitoring again in future years. For two foliage gleaning species, the American redstart and the rose-breasted grosbeak, caterpillar biomass was actually one of the most important predictor variables that predicted their abundance. And so this shows that their abundance is driven more by food availability than structural habitat characteristics. And so this is the last result I'll talk about today. We've circled back to mass abundance ratios. So if you remember from earlier when I was talking about my hypotheses, I was predicting that the managed and unmanaged sites would both kind of follow the same pattern, where the upper bounds limits of the mass abundance ratio of understory forest birds would be parallel. And that is true. So this indicates that forest management isn't changing anything fundamental about bird communities, but you'll see that the managed line is a lot higher. And so we're seeing more energy, more resources in the system, a greater abundance of forest birds across all body sizes. So this is pretty strong evidence for the habitat improvements that can come from woodland management for the majority of forest birds. And so in conclusion, in this study area, we've seen increased caterpillar biomass and bird abundance and richness in response to management. And so if we're thinking about managing for things like plants or oak regeneration, we can be pretty assured that forest birds will also be responding positively. But I do want to point out, these are the results of 2 years of fieldwork in sites that have been managed for less than 10 years. And so this is really the short-term effects of management. And we're hoping to continue doing this monitoring work for a lot longer to see how these patterns change into the future. I also wanted to mention that two of the species that did not have a positive or that didn't increase in population in response to management, the wood thrush and the ovenbird, I don't really want to glaze over because these are both neotropical migrant species that are facing widespread declines. And so I think it brings up a really important point about the role of woodland management when we think about landscape resilience. And this is a term that we hear as conservationists and ecologists a lot, and there's a lot of different definitions. But this is one I really like. It's very simple, straightforward. Resilient landscapes are more likely to retain high quality habitat and a diverse array of species during climate change. So this is something that scientists working for the Nature Conservancy have kind of developed. And I think it guides a lot of their land management goals. And they've divided or thought about landscape resilience in terms of different dimensions, which can kind of help you apply it a little bit better to landscapes. The first dimension is setting. So when you're thinking about resilience, is the full range of historic habitats still present on the landscape? And I think here we can use this opportunity to think back to these maps of historic vegetation communities in Wisconsin. And while, yes, all habitat types are probably represented, they're in very different proportion to the way they were 150 years ago. And certainly some of them won't be here much longer without management interventions.
Is that the Baraboo Hills? Is the
Yeah, so it's actually not. The green chunk that shows up in the mid-1800s map is a little bit further west in the driftless area. I think the corner, but might include the Baraboo Hills. But yeah, that's a really good question. There's another dimension of landscape resilience is process. And it's important to think about the characteristic processes that have shaped the landscape, shaped the natural communities there. And here I think fire is probably one of the most important ones that we know we don't have in the same amount that we used to. Connectivity is really important for landscape resilience. And I think especially in a place that's very fragmented by agriculture, thinking about whether or not species and different woodland remnants can still move around is important. And these dimensions all kind of lean on each other. So you can see how if you think about these three, it's a lot easier to think about maintaining the full range of species diversity within a landscape. And I like this image. It's taken from nearby some of my study sites, but you can see that even within the single landscape, within one contiguous forest, there's a lot of different landscape features and different forest types. And so while woodland management is really important, it's not the only solution to be using across this whole landscape. So I mentioned a few times that I'm working on long-term monitoring as far as what will happen after more years of woodland management, and also just in general with climate change and other changes in this area. And so you can follow this project as they're working on it over the next couple of years. We try to post updates pretty regularly on this website so you can see what we're up to, what we've learned. And we also do some outreach events every summer, talking a little bit more about how do we do bird banding, what have we learned recently. It's worth checking out. And then finally, I'd like to just acknowledge the many field techs, volunteers, conservationists, landowners in this area that I'm really lucky to be able to work with. And with that, I'll take any questions.
I just wanted to know, when you say management, how often do they do fires and things like that? What exactly is the management? Because sometimes when people do the burning, they do it too frequently in woodlands. Also, is the spill on fire in woodlands?
That's a really good question. And that's also a question that I'm not sure if anyone has the exact answer to yet. I think it's pretty site specific. I can tell you that in my sites, the people have been burning, the Nature Conservancy landowners have been burning every maybe 1 to 4 years. And so it kind of depends what your goal is. If there's a lot of shrubs that are encroaching and you might need to do more frequent burns for some time, that could be important early on. But there is some concern too about burning too frequently and harming the insect community. So I think there's a balance in there somewhere.
There's another question right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, going further along the question of managing, when you say manage forests, is this work that's performed by a service foresters from the DNR, or are there other people that are also involved in the forestry management aspect of this?
Yeah, great question. It certainly could be DNR. There's a lot of great management work that's been done by DNR on their own properties and DNR foresters on private land. Right. But it's a full range. So the Nature Conservancy has a really active land stewardship crew that probably just by acreage does the most work in this area. There's private consultant companies. There's just really dedicated landowners that work as well. So yeah.
I would like to know more about how you are counting caterpillar biomass, because those caterpillars are way up there in the overstory.
Yeah.
Can be to people walking around on the ground necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. And right now we do mostly just focus on the caterpillars that are within reach. So we're just looking at the understory layer of the forest. which has pros and cons. It's a lot easier to sample a larger area and more tree species quickly, but we're not entirely convinced that the same things that are happening in the understory are happening in the canopy too. So there's different methods of looking at that, but we haven't really delved into it yet. Yeah.
Thank you, fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. I know so little about terrestrial stuff. Can you talk a little about the bottom up at the top down controls on, are caterpillars just a function of trees they can eat, or is bird density keeping the controls at a level?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I guess it depends a little bit, probably on the year, because the first year of this study, 2021, was a year of a really incredible caterpillar outbreak in two of our study areas. And so in that time, I think it was there were way more caterpillars than birds could possibly eat. But we also, if you just are observing how many caterpillars birds are eating every day or provisioning to their nest, it's definitely taking a pretty big chunk of the biomass out of the system. And so that's a question that I'm definitely curious about looking into later. Yeah.
Just to add to that, Mark Boyce, Canada looked at that question, actually went to the CRC at this point, and they cannot control outbreaks, but they do lower populations in that outbreak.
Yeah.
But the problem with the question of relative caterpillars versus absolute, when you look back at the German study that showed that overall insect populations have plummeted, maybe not old enough to see windshield insects on the windshield of your car, but it's in a drop.
Yeah.
And so that would be more of a relative benefit to your absolute distance. And there's a question that you're making comparison. So if you just look in one place relative to the same place in the other place, it's a relative versus an absolute method. There's other follow-up question would be if you're not looking at overall carbon sequestration.
Yeah. Wow, you guys have you're really listening. Yeah, so to your first question about trying to measure insect abundance between different forest areas when maybe we aren't quite sure about absolute insect abundance, especially looking at a historical baseline. I think that's a great point. And there have been a few longer term studies about insect biomass. Well, not necessarily biomass, but kind of as a byproduct of other studies, especially malaise trapping studies. We have a little indication that there was a much greater insect biomass at one point. But it's pretty tough for us to learn much about that now. But that is why we're trying to collect a lot of data that could be used as a baseline in the future. And then your second point about carbon sequestration. Yeah, this is something I kind of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole the past few weeks thinking about. It's a really important question, and it definitely would feel a lot nicer to be planting trees right now than thinning and burning forests, just from a perspective of trying to have less carbon in the atmosphere. So woodland ecosystems are different from like closed canopy, really large forests, like in northern Wisconsin, in that they didn't ever sequester that level of carbon. And right now, some of the novel forest conditions that I was talking about that are really dense forests do have a lot of carbon in them. So if we're thinking about restoring agricultural lands back into woodlands, there will be a carbon sink there. But if we're restoring the biodiversity of a woodland, we might not necessarily be hitting the same goal of sequestering a lot of carbon. The caveat to that would be if the understory plant community there's been some evidence that as those plants are growing every year and then decomposing every year, they increase the nitrogen content, which allows woody vegetation to grow more. And so it might not be as big of a discrepancy as we thought. But certainly when we have novel forest conditions where ashes and elms that are really susceptible to Dutch elm disease and emerald ash borer are the dominant tree species, they'll never reach the older age classes. And so that is a big concern. Yes.
We have a few questions in the chat. First one, what are thought to be optimal habitat conditions for ovenbirds and wood thrush? How might those conditions fit into restoration goals?
Yeah, great questions. So optimal habitat for wood thrush and ovenbird seems to be related to having really large, extensive patches of forest. And so we know that that's something that we don't have very much of in southern Wisconsin, and places like the Baraboo Hills are one of the last remaining areas like that. And so it is important to maintain these large blocks of forest, but it brings up the question, if you're thinning the understory in the middle of one of these blocks of forest, what does that do to those species? It seems like ovenbirds, so these are species that forage on the ground and also build nests out of leaves on the ground. And so the first couple of years after a prescribed fire, whether it was in the spring or the fall, we'll certainly see reductions in their populations, but they do seem to return after a couple of years. They really just like large music areas of forest, usually without like a lot of rocks or anything, but we do certainly have a lot of patches of habitat like that around our management units too. Yeah.
The people who study the insects, do they differentiate between the hairy caterpillars and the sweetings? Because when you speak of outbreaks, I usually think of the hairy ones.
Yeah.
They're very different birds that specialize in eating birds.
Right.
Yeah. And so I was just wondering, do they eat giant?
Yeah, we do. We do for exactly that reason. Oh yeah, absolutely. So wondering about differentiating between the hairy caterpillars and the other caterpillars, and we're doing these surveys, and especially during outbreak years, which have in the past, there have been a lot of outbreaks of eastern tent caterpillar, especially, which is one of the hairy ones. And yeah, it's not really clear if birds will eat the hairy caterpillars as much as the other ones. And so usually I don't include those in biomass calculations, because I want to make sure I'm including what is a food source to the birds. Yeah.
All right, we have 2 more questions on Zoom.
Yeah.
Are you concerned about tree disease like hypoxia, canker, and dieback in oaks? Oaks, sorry, or about the emerald ash borer?
Yeah. So tree disease is definitely an issue that we think about, mainly because emerald ash borer, just between the year that I started the study and this winter, there's been a huge dieback of ash trees across this area. And it was one of the dominant tree species. So it really is changing the landscape quite a bit. And as far as like the oak, and if it's like sudden oak death, it is a concern, especially when you really are like managing a lot to favor oak trees. If there's an outbreak of tree disease, you can have patches where all the overstory trees then will be lost from an area. We really haven't had too many issues with that, like at a landscape scale in this site though. So it's, if anything, resulted in kind of a patchy woodland landscape with some small openings, which turns out to be really ideal habitat for forest birds. So.
Last question is, how do you determine the health of caterpillar population and whether it can be used in determining the frequency of forest fires?
Wow. Yeah, that's a good question. So right now we've actually been studying caterpillars for 2 years in this study, and 2 years before this during my master's. And so we're starting to get an idea of what the range of variability might be. Of course, we had a year with a really high population of caterpillars in the mix, and so it's a little bit hard to tell. But it seems like, yeah, with management, definitely if we're starting to change the composition of tree species, that could be favoring caterpillars, but we also want to make sure that burning too frequently won't reduce the populations too.
Thank you, Maya, for your presentation. I have another question about caterpillars.
Yeah.
Are there any specific species that you saw that seem to be more affected by management than others, or that contribute more to the biomass changes and stuff?
We're still kind of working on that, actually. So we're focusing on just calculating the caterpillar biomass, which is not species specific, for the first couple of years, but we're also really interested in trying to identify some species and learn some caterpillar tree connections as well. One interesting thing, and and this is more anecdotal, I guess, because it wasn't really what we were focusing on. But there's maple spanworm caterpillars are one of the really abundant ones during the outbreak year in 2021. And the highest density of those caterpillars that we saw anywhere was in the heart of one of the managed areas. And so we're not really sure what to make of that yet. But yeah, it's something we're thinking about. Yeah.
Question about what's,
Yeah.
so. Thinking of the way this was meaningless, because I was reading that some species were really low, density. So most probably somewhere of course conservation and somewhere where of course more because they just more density. So
Yeah. So are you talking about the abundance, like the box plots where some were really, really small differences? Yeah. So a lot of cases, those plots were all statistically significant. So I guess, sorry, just to back up, the question is about if abundances of bird populations between managed and unmanaged sites were really close together, how statistically significant is that? All right, great. And so it's kind of, it brings up the question of like, yes, they all were statistically significant, but what is the ecological significance of a 0.03 difference in a bird abundance? And so probably not very much. Yeah.
thank you for the talk. I was wondering how long do you think you need to study this, continue these studies in order to get a better idea of a lot of these questions?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure. I think it's a little bit tough because the easiest way to study woodland management is to look at the short-term effects. And so that's what most people have done so far. And there's been some like comparative studies of going back to a site after it's been managed, but not studied for a couple decades, maybe. But learning about the small ecological changes like along the way is not very common. So, but I can't give you an exact number right now of how long it will take. Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious, why is Tennessee such a prime area for researching this type? Is it because it's sort of a climatic crossroads?
Oh, interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, I think it's a place like similar to southern Wisconsin where there certainly were a lot of oak woodlands and a lot of, I mean, with like the mountains on one side, a lot of different habitat situations. But I'm not sure if that has much to do with why there are so many studies located in that area. Yeah.
Any more questions for Maya? Okay, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight.